Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am Bridget Bailey. I am your moderator for this next panel, which is a topic very close to my heart, namely infrastructure in Africa. I am a partner at Herbert Smith Freehills, and I have spent a very long time, I'm not going to say how long because that'll age me, it'll tell you exactly how old I am, doing infrastructure around Africa. And I have a really exciting panel of experts with me to discuss this topic today. I'm going to start off by asking them each to introduce themselves. Before I do so, please note that we welcome your questions, we welcome your comments. So please use the chat forum to raise questions and comments. If you're addressing a question or a comment to a specific speaker, please will you state that in your question or comment so we can make sure the right person answers it. That's not to say that the rest of us won't address your comment or question, because I think we're all extremely knowledgeable and we've all got a lot to say. So without any further ado, I'm going to ask Anna-Marie Ace from Turner & Townsend to introduce herself.
Thank you very much, Bridget, for the opportunity. As with you, I'm delighted to be here today. I am a director in the Turner & Townsend business. Also, I've been with Turner & Townsend and advising in PPPs and infrastructure for a long time. Also won't give away the duration because, we don't give away our age. But very much involved in the infrastructure PPP space for a long time, and also across the African continent, very, very interested in that space. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Anna-Marie. I'm going to hand over to Joshua Ogwal from Lugomark Advocates in Uganda to introduce himself. Joshua is the one man who's brave enough to be the thorn amongst today's roses. Joshua?
Thank you very much for that, Bridget. Hopefully I will not be a thorn, but thank you. Unfortunately for me, unlike the beautiful young ladies that have spoken before me, my grays have already given me away. I'm a lawyer. I've been practicing in the infrastructure space for close to 20 years now, both within the financial sector and outside of the financial sector. A large aspect of my expertise has been in the energy field. I'm currently a partner with a law firm called Lugomark Advocates based in Kampala, Uganda. At the same time, I also run the Asset Reconstruction Company, which was set up to identify assets in various sectors that are doing fairly badly and restructure. That's a little bit about me, and I'll be happy to say a lot more as we go forward. Thank you, Bridget.
Great, thank you, Joshua. I'm going to ask Adiola Sanmola from Udoma and Bello Osagi in Nigeria to introduce herself. She, again, is a partner in that firm.
Thank you indeed, Bridget. Good day, everyone. It's great to be here. Bridget has very kindly introduced me. Yes, indeed, I am a partner in Udoma and Bello Osagi, which is a leading law firm in Nigeria. My areas of practice include energy, infrastructure, financing for real estate construction and infrastructure projects in Nigeria. One of the things I like about my practice is the ability to advise parties from the project development stage up to financing, which then means that I get to see projects from the beginning to the end, and that's really gratifying. I've been practicing law for almost 20 years as well, so that means that I've seen quite a number of projects during this time, from road projects to rail projects to ports and to the development and financing of energy projects in Nigeria. It's great to be here, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Adela. I'm going to ask Wodwa Mbele, who is definitely not she might be last, but she's definitely not least, because she is the lady that holds the money bags. And so she's extremely important to all of us who are participating in this session.
Thank you very much, Bridget, and to the listeners as well. My name is Zodwa Mbele. I'm the group executive responsible for transacting at DBSA, essentially the team that undertakes the due diligence up to a point of reaching financial close. The DBSA is a development finance institution that operates not only in South Africa, but outside South Africa with a specific focus on the sub-Saharan Africa, though it's owned by South African government. The infrastructure sectors that we cover across, it's more catalytic for economic development, transport sector, energy sector, water sector, social sector, as well as roads as well that we cover. So yeah, it's just across the spectrum of as long as it catalyzes the economic development and also it uplifts the social being, that's what DBSA focus on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there's a lot that we're going to learn from you today, Zodwa, as to how to structure these projects successfully and what is meant by a socio and economic catalyst and what the DBSA is actually looking for, because I think very often, or more often than not, in the African context, we do need the DFIs to get the infrastructure off the ground, and particularly the DBSA, which is an African-founded, African-focused DFI that's completely and utterly African, and quite one of the few that is completely and utterly African, I would say. On that note, I'm going to ask Anna Marie, who I understand does a lot in the PPP advisory sector, but also is involved in the independent monitoring of projects once we lawyers have exited after financial close, to give us some of her takeaways as to what has made projects successful, what her clients, both on the government side and the private sector side, look for, and what's gone wrong. Because I think it's from the lessons of what's gone wrong that we learn the most. So Anna Marie, if you would like to give us your views on those particular issues, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget. Yes, we've definitely been involved, or it's a focus area for us around the operations phase. Of course, through the life cycle of the project, there's always a big focus on the development stage, and those, that's a very important stage of the projects, of course, because actually in the operation stage, what has happened up front actually influences that. So in terms of specifying, the initial requirements, the output specifications, etc., those are critical elements in the implementation stage. Often there's a view that the project ends at financial close, as you say, and then construction happens, and after construction, all of the things that have gone wrong, the people sit in the operation stage. So I think as part of the structuring from the initial perspective, that operator involvement, in any infrastructure and in that SPV is of critical importance. And I think for government entities, it would be very critical to actually ensure that involvement, that is actually an evaluation criteria even at the beginning, that operator must have input and insights in sort of the design, development, etc., and any infrastructure to allow for proper maintenance and sort of resolving issues already at that point. Also, with regard to that initial sort of the specification is those handback requirements in terms of at the end of a project, where would you want to sit? Often, and I think that's a critical for me. Often what you find, and a key success factor, is that in terms of the public sector contract management team, for me, one of the elements that have been an issue, and especially I think in the South African market, is that once you appoint that private party entity, you walk away and you meet once a month, if you're lucky, maybe once a quarter. And, I suppose Gautrain is a good example of how it should be managed. It should be a very, very, very strong public sector team in place to actually manage, because it's about contract management. I think there's often a fear in government institutions that we don't want to go PPP because then what will we do? But there's a very, very big role to play during the operational phase and the implementation stages. So for me, I think, and there's a lot of transitions. So you go from procurement up until construction and then into operations, and your skill set in government changes through those periods. And I think it's a critical point to keep in mind that you'll have a key team in place for government, and that you need to be open for the consultant, the legal advisor who comes in at specific points actually to advise you when things go wrong, when there is a big dispute or etc. So to be open for that. So in terms of the operation stage, I think that for me is one of the biggest elements, is that capacity from a government perspective, and that is built up from the development stage right through when you get to financial close. You actually need to take the whole institution team needs to be part and parcel of that. It's not a new team that starts at operation. They need to know the contract, and it's a document that they have to know from beginning to end to be able to manage that contract. And that for me is a critical point in operations. It doesn't have to be a big team depending on the project, but it has to be an experienced team that knows the contract. And maybe just a last element, something that is also an independent monitor type role, is a shadow model, because often the private sector entities would run the model. They would then say, well, this is the penalties that we see at the end of this month. And often government entities are at a deficit because they just have to accept it. If you actually have a shadow model running to actually test those penalties, that also puts government in a very strong position. Maybe that I should stop there, Bridget, because I don't want to take everybody else's time, but as a starting point, I think that's my contribution.
I think there are two very important issues that you've raised for me, and that is one of the first issue is I see with my clients that everyone thinks the finance docs are very sexy, and everyone in the private sector side wants to focus on the finance docs because that's the sexy stuff. And the EPC and O&M contracts are left to the poor engineers and the poor EPC lawyers, and no one else really pays much attention to them. And that's really where guts lies, I think. The concession agreement, the PPA, the EPC, the O&M, and those are the difficult contracts. Those are complex, technically difficult documents, and I don't think they get enough attention. The other point that I want to raise to come back to is, once everyone's had their introductory comments, is I don't think that governments necessarily focus on their own internal skills. So what we see in South Africa is that you'll have a project officer for, say, the Department of Environmental Affairs. You'll be very involved in doing that PPP. And then that skill set is not really developed further. That project officer stays on that project and they don't go and work on another PPP. And I always think that that's very sad. I think that the government needs to have that core function of PPP experts who are government officials. So I'm going to leave that for you to think about, because I think it is something that is definitely needed for the skill set development, and ask Adeola to take us through what she has seen work, what she's seen fail in Nigeria, and any unique features of the Nigerian market that she wants to raise for our audience to consider.
Okay. Thank you, Bridget. I think for me, what I have seen worked the best for infrastructure projects in Nigeria would be projects where there's sufficient government support. I think that for infrastructure projects to be successful and to be deployed as quickly as possible, there has to be a significant level of government support in those projects, whether in the form of equity contribution by the government or in the form of an enabling regulatory environment, or in the form of guarantees. I do find that, when this form of support is modeled into infrastructure projects, those projects tend to be successful and becomes, a kind of model that other projects would wish to copy. Whether we've had, many of those projects is another issue, but there are a few examples. In the port sector, for example, there is an element of government support in the Lekki Port project, which is currently under development. And in that project, there was equity contribution by the government, even though it's a project that's being developed by the private sector. I also find that when there are incentives, projects tend to, be as successful as they should be. In Nigeria, we have a framework for granting tax incentives to certain projects in certain sectors, especially projects that that fall within a particular framework or threshold. And when those, sort of projects are able to take the benefits of these incentives, it becomes more attractive to investors. Another example is the Azura Power Project, which is a circa 500 megawatt thermal power project in Nigeria. And this project was successful because of the level of government support that went into that project, both in terms of, equity contribution by the state where the project is situated, and also in the context of how, the risk framework was put together, how risks were analyzed, and how, different risks, were addressed in terms of mitigants. Also in that project, there is what the World Bank Group put together as a partial risk guarantee, as well as an indemnity agreement, which sort of sets out a framework for government to support the project and to participate. And there are also several guarantees. So I found that when projects, are structured in this manner, where there is a significant element of government support that addresses many things, including the risk of expropriation, I think that's very important. Where the risk of expropriation is adequately addressed, then, investors and project sponsors are able to take projects to completion.
Thank you, Adeola. I think that's very insightful. And I think another big issue to address the risk of expropriation, which is obviously something that everyone always worries about in respect of Africa, amongst other areas like LATAM, is if the contract is fair. If there's not a sense by the government that the private sector has taken advantage or has imposed on them terms that are not balanced.
Absolutely. There has to be a balance. Yes.
Yeah. And one of the issues that I'm interested in hearing from you, whether Nigeria has a particular issue with wanting to use the Naira for payments under its various contracts, or whether they're comfortable having payments due in dollars. That's obviously a big issue in South Africa, where our government doesn't like making payments in dollars, including in respect of things like gas and oil under power purchase agreements. They want everything in dollars. What's the view in Nigeria around that?
There is the same concern. But, the currency of payment is dependent on various factors, including the currency of the loan, and the currency of payment under the relevant offtake agreement. All of these have to be put into to be analyzed during the project feasibility stage and project development stage in order for parties to determine which currency is actually appropriate. In Nigeria, we even have concerns we have issues that border on dollar liquidity.
Yeah.
We do have those issues now. However, the currency of payment would always depend on the currency of the loan and the applicable currency under the relevant offtake agreement. I think these are important in order to determine, what currency would be reflected in any tariff payments, for utility projects, and etc.
And do you have deep Naira lending markets?
Yes,
So
by that, do you mean local banks financing?
Yeah.
Yes, we
Yes.
do. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. And what we also have in Nigeria is a situation where projects are funded on the basis of two currencies. So there are certain projects where, funding is provided by international investors on the basis of a foreign currency, such as the United States dollars. And for that same project, local banks make their commitments in Naira. We've seen this happen in some instances.
Okay, that's really good to know, because I think that's one of the things that's been holding back African infrastructures, the need to borrow extensively in dollars. And on that note, I'm going to ask Zodwa for the view of the DBSA in respect of the type of projects they're prepared to lend to and what they're seeing happen around the African continent in respect of infrastructure, as well as what they like to see to make a project successful.
Okay. Thank you once again. So in just, as a DFIs, we have also realized that money is not a problem. There are so many projects out there. So there's lots of money out there, but there are very few bankable projects. So as a bank and with other DFIs, obviously, we have moved into what we call the upstream work, where we also provide facilities, project preparation facility, with the buying in the rights of first refusal at the time when we need to reach financial close to be one of the lenders in the project. And we have done that, some of them successfully together with other partners in just countries like as far as the West Africa. We've prepared some of the projects in countries like Sierra Leone, some of them in other East African countries. Some obviously still have to go through some regulatory hurdles, but we've, other than in South Africa, of course, we've done some in South Africa. But again, for us to land in any infrastructure projects, we also need to be comfortable with the regulatory framework. It needs to be certainty. We know South Africa has got a matured legal framework in terms of the PPP. I mean, Bridget has already indicated it dates back to the days of the N4 Maputo corridor, possibly was the first test. If you've been in the project finance space, you would know that. But we've seen other countries are progressing. Some they've got PPP framework, but they've yet to be tested, implemented. So we just want to have always the certainty in terms of regulatory framework, and the procurement issues as well. Framework are also key for us, because as we go into certain countries, much as procurement needs to be very clear as a policy, very precise, but yet flexibility is required, where you can sole source as well as when you can also open it for tender. But for as long as the project meets the criteria set up in the regulatory framework of that particular country when it comes to procurement, it becomes very topical, because we are talking multi-billion rands worth of projects, and they can be easily attacked legally. So we always want to be comfortable with that regime of the regulatory framework. I think the issues of bankability, the offtake agreements also, we would like to get some certainty, especially the concessions. also they need to have followed the Triple P framework. But also in some cases you don't have that, but we do like to see government, not necessarily participation, because we are also advocating for the private sector participation in certain countries. But just for us to ensure that when they also have the offtake agreements are long enough such that the project can be funded and affordable. And financing, yes, it's a package that comes in later, whether it's a long-term financing, but affordability is also key. So the offtake should be long enough. Otherwise, if you have a short-term offtake agreement, it means the sponsors of the project need to recoup their returns quickly. They need to price it up, and it doesn't make sense. It's not affordable anymore. So that's what we see. But what you would like, everyone has had some experience in energy. I think energy is one of the sectors that have been, I would say, they are matured in many countries, and all of us around the table have done energy. But we've done as a bank a lot of also, so we've seen maturity in that, but we also like to see more in other sectors. Like the ports, we've seen just maybe very few. Obviously, not all the countries have got the oceans for them to have to optimize, their oceans. But we've seen, Angola is moving in that direction. We've done a port in Namibia. Rail projects are equally key in most cases, and these are huge and complex projects that would like to do more. Ghana is opening up in respect of that. So a number of those, if they could be just a better direction from the government to ensure that they open up certain sectors, that not only the energy sector. Maybe last part of it, what we have done is DFI, we established a DFI fragility forum as well. There's about few of us as DFIs focusing in certain countries. We've selected about 7 pilot countries in, not necessarily in Africa, because one of them is Nepal. We are focusing, as DBSA, we've participated in 3 of them, which is Ethiopia, DRC, as well as, so it's Ethiopia, DRC, and Madagascar, yeah. So, and in there, we're just using our convening, ability to always have the discussion with government to advocate for private sector participation. If you understand Ethiopia, for instance, a lot of work or infrastructure is rolled out by the sovereign, is the borrower. So for the first time, I think you must have picked up in the newspapers, they've issued the GSM license, the telecommunication. I think Vodacom won that. But those are the kind of the reforms that they need to, liberalize their sectors as well. They are looking into liberalizing also the financial sectors, not that everything should be owned by government and controlled by government. So you see so that's, again, we work hand in hand with the other DFIs who are on the ground, the likes of the CDC and the IFC. They have offices on the ground there and have meetings with government on daily basis, just to open it up so that countries don't borrow themselves to death. Because if it's government only, forever indebted. Luckily, I think Ethiopia has got also, it did qualify for some concessional funding from the World Bank. But that's not the sustainable way of looking at it. You also want to open pockets of private sector participation as one of the areas that you want to focus on. Thanks.
Thanks, Zodwa. I think what you're saying is certainly music to my ears, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to persuade Transnet to do some private sector participation in the ports and rail sector. I won't ask you to go off mute and comment on that, but that would be my prayer. Joshua, I'm going to ask you to give us the perspective from Uganda. Where I understand you were saying earlier before we started the session that you're starting to develop your legislation and you've got frameworks in place now and you've got some interesting projects on the go. I think the audience would be extremely interested in hearing your perspective, because Uganda is always a country of interest to the rest of us in Africa.
Thank you very much, Bridget. And obviously a lot has already been said in terms of the principles by the previous speakers, where there has been quite a bit of success in Uganda. The PPP space has been in the power sector, as in many other countries, and really it's been driven, again, really by the strength of the regulation, ensuring that the regulation gives predictability on the various stages of the project, at the development phase, how do these projects get identified? How do they get evaluated? How do they finally get licensed? Or how does the ownership move to the developer? So having absolute clarity that area, and then on the operation side, how is there absolute clarity and standardization on the kind of documents that are going to be executed for the offtake side, the kind of guarantees that the government is going to be given, and the terms of those guarantees. So there's absolute clarity for the investors and for the financiers, and that has worked very well in the power sector. Now we've seen that move into the water space. There's a lot that is being done. A lot of work is being done again in dealing with the regulation around water transportation, so that we can have more ports, inland ports being set up, and boosting a lot of the potential revenues that can come out of water transportation. Uganda obviously has one of the largest lakes in Africa, which shares it with Kenya and Tanzania, and there's a huge opportunity there with regard to water tourism and transportation. So that's something that is a lot of work is being done on. Also, there's a lot of regulatory work being done around putting in place a framework for road toll systems operational in Uganda. What the government has done is it has worked on, first and foremost, the financing of critical road infrastructure, with the aim of ensuring that subsequent to the financing of this infrastructure, it can then pass it on to the private sector for management. So there's currently the phase is beefing up the regulation. Bridget, you've asked early on what are the things that have caused failure in some of these infrastructure projects. Now, fortunately, in Uganda, we've not had failure, and I pray it will not happen. But we've been in situations where we've had to advise regulators on deals that are going wrong, that are having challenges. And it's interesting you mentioned the issue of fairness, because where these transactions have had challenges, it's really been because of the pricing structure. At the commencement of the project, it was needed heavily by the government. The government was willing to pay any price for it, so the investor managed to get away with a really good return on investment. And in addition to that, having all its costs met. 10 years down the line, it's no longer a highly risky project, because all that needed to be known about it is now known. The uncertainties on the markets that were previously unknown are now absolutely clear, and there is every justification to bring down the return. Many times the government wants to have a renegotiation, and the developer is not willing, the investor is not willing to have that. Now, inevitably, government still remains the underwriter of the infrastructure projects, because from the perspective of the consumer, who, as we all know, is also the voter, they always want utility services provided at as minimal a cost as possible. And remember, they are the voter, and government is run by politicians. So we've had scenarios where, again, largely in the power sector, we've had scenarios where there's been need to sit down and do reviews on the pricing. And that's something which, again, boils down to how fair is the pricing sector. Are there opportunities for repricing based on actual weight, or are there other opportunities that are the investor to be able to exit at an appropriate time? So those are really the perspective I'd like to provide. Thanks.
I think that last topic that you raised, Joshua, is a massive topic for future discussion. I think we've seen a few projects not expropriated, but governments cancel them because there was a sense that the current tariff mechanisms were not fair. I'm thinking of some rail projects. I'm thinking of some border post projects. And in South Africa, we've seen the government try to renegotiate the tariffs on the round 1 and round 2, our REAP, Renewable Energy IPP procurement program, because the sense is that the tariffs are terribly high there. And it is a topic that I want to circle back to, because this is one of the issues, and Africa's not alone in this. There's stories in Spain. Spain wanted to renegotiate tariffs. I think France wanted to renegotiate tariffs. So when it's not an African issue, but I think it is a very key issue for going forward. And it's obviously a key concern for someone like Zodwa at a bank, which has banked the transaction on the earlier tariffs. And I want to pick up on this topic first before I go back to Anna-Marie, where we go. I want to talk about, Anna-Marie, just to give you a heads up, I want to talk about capacitating government so that they're not scared of PPPs and IPPs. But Zodwa, what is your view as a lender around this requirement often from governments a few years down the line when the project's been de-risked to rediscuss the tariff and or the basic charges?
Yeah, it's not a very ideal situation in the sense that, it compromises the country in terms of being an investor friendly. So it doesn't become a localized discussion that is between the sponsors and the government. We've seen that as well in Ghana. And we met with the minister there just to get a sense and also express our discomfort with what is happening, because also it doesn't augur very well, because we can easily foreclose on projects and government needs to pay up, which is still detrimental to government. But obviously it's not something we can easily, wake up and do. But we're just also showing them the other perspective in respect of that. Whilst we appreciated maybe where the government came from, but also an amicable solution that is also aligned with the sponsors is what we will support, because the sponsors, they are the ones who have put in the tariff, the IRRs, if they can still work, if it means elongating the PPA in order to still have the same economics and make it still affordable, so be it. So we are flexible in finding the solution that will work for both parties, especially for the country, for affordability. It's also important. So, but it shouldn't be seen as something that government will just willy-nilly and unilaterally decide to implement without consulting, because the solution lies within the team, the tripartite, being the lenders as well as also, the sponsors of the project, as well as the affordability issues. So we are confronted with that. So it's up to them. We're guided by the sponsors on how they want to move, but we've had our side discussions with government in respect of that.
Well, that's really good to know. Sorry, Joshua, you want to come in there?
Yes, if I may, Bridget, and thanks for that. Just one thing which also maybe needs to be taken into account as we talk about the tariff structures is the reality that many times this is also driven by the costs, and one of the chief costs is the cost of lending. I remember a couple of years back, I was asked by one of the administrators in our Ministry of Energy, just look at the structure of what was Uganda's first IPP, and I looked at the lending rates of many of the banks, and I have worked in financial institutions, but I was agape when I looked at some of the lending rates. And one could see why the cost of power from that entity was extremely high. And what it probably tells us is that one of the things that governments need to do in Africa is put in place certain incentives and an environment that helps to deepen the local capital markets, because that is one source that will help to reduce the cost of infrastructure. If you can have deals such that they have a lot more local financing, that inevitably reduces the cost of financing, both in terms of the potential currency risk and also you get more financing from local finance, who at times also have more understanding and more comfort in the market risk. So that's one of the things which probably needs to be looked at. And I think DFIs have a very big role to play in ensuring that the governments, they can work with the governments to have this done, because it helps everyone, all the potential financiers in the projects. It gives more stability to the pricing and therefore to the project.
Yeah, I think what we've seen in South Africa, and I'll bring you in now, Adeola, what we've seen in South Africa is that the South African government feels a lot more comfortable when the borrowings are in rand and when it's local institutions, because the government can have a conversation with them more easily, I think, in their minds than they can with international banks. And the local financial institutions have a deep vested interest in the country. So, Adeola, you have raised your hand, and it's obviously you in Nigeria. What are your perspectives?
I wanted to contribute to the comment that Joshua made about, about currency risks, if I may put it that way, and he's absolutely right. In Nigeria, project sponsors used to prefer to take loans in foreign currency because the cost of lending was cheaper than it was relatively cheaper than taking loans from commercial banks in local currency. That has changed slightly because, when we went into a recession, when Nigeria went into a recession in 2016, and then last year, on account of COVID, we've had dollar liquidity challenges. But that was one of the reasons prior to, these times, one of the most significant reasons why they preferred to take loans in foreign currency was because of pricing. Now, going back to that point about, how to get, better financing, we are also seeing that project sponsors, rather than, rather than look to traditional lending, are also looking to the debt capital markets to raise capital. And we're finding that the debt capital market in Nigeria is actually very active now for this reason, because they find that the pricing is more favorable. So we're seeing bonds being issued, we're seeing commercial papers, being issued by project sponsors and project companies and issuers in order to fund infrastructure projects. And we're finding this to be very interesting. While there's still some level of activity for local banks, the bond markets and the debt capital markets has significantly increased in the past couple of years, I would say.
That's very interesting, because as yet in South Africa, we haven't seen that move to the debt capital markets for projects. We have seen a huge use of funding from pension funds and life assurance companies, and particularly in the form of inflation-linked debt. Zodwa, does the DBSA lend only in ZAR and dollars, or are you able to lend in other currencies, and particularly local currencies?
So far, we have not managed to lend in local currency. It's something that we've said we'll be looking into. I know there's a transaction that we meant to finalize in East Africa, in Uganda to be specific, and we have used the TCX, which is where we can provide dollars as DBSA, and TCX, it's an exchange based in the Netherlands, and you can then exchange it into the local currency and provide the shillings that are required. And of course, the repayment back to DBSA would be in dollars. So that would be one test case of what we own TCX, by the way, as DBSA. It's just that very few opportunities have come our way for us to consider that. But otherwise, we provide funding in ZAR as well as in hard currency and in euros as well, in the hard currency basket being dollars and the euros. That's what we have provided so far. Thanks.
That's really interesting. But I think we've been focusing so far on the financial aspects. And I think in my personal view, one of the issues that makes governments shy away from PPPs, concessions, IPPs, is the sense that they're losing control and also that they are very heavily dependent on consultants and they don't necessarily have the skills in-house. Now, Anna-Marie Turner and Townsend works extensively with governments in respect to the projects they implement. And I know if you've been working on Gautrain, which is a project very close to my heart, where we've seen government be very actively involved and be properly skilled. I'm interested in hearing your views and your wish list, actually, as to how we could overcome this reticence on government's part, particularly on the skill side of things.
Yes, Bridget, I think also, if you look at obviously a wider context as well, not only South Africa, a lot of African governments are putting in place PPP frameworks, regulations, etc. And I think that's a good starting point for, giving government that comfort, that certainty that there is a framework, that it is supported by the National Development Plan, that it's supported by the Office of the President. If you put that pipeline, that certainty, in a way, a programmatic approach in place already, I think that's a very good starting point so that people actually give attention to the PPPs and the skill set that's necessary there. I think it's a critical element, as you say, in terms of the success of the PPPs. And it's often been used, the analogy about it's like a marriage and it's a long-term contract. If the one party is weak, does not know the process, etc., that will cause issues. So for me, I think in terms of government officials, it's a key requirement that actually there is in central government, in the PPP unit, that skills transfer, but often in the procuring entities, in the institutions that actually the Department of Transport, Water Affairs, etc. PPPs are often a very foreign and as you say, uncomfortable place for them. And we're currently working with a client that, also not a South African client, that they've decided to go down the PPP route, but they are feeling extremely uncomfortable with the fact that this is their core service and they're going to be outsourcing it. And I think the transaction advisor plays a key role there in taking the client with them through the process, explaining, how they can actually get involved, how they need to be involved through the process. And specifying at each stage what it is that they want. And I think that involvement as well in the operation stage, that they can actually manage but not take on risk unnecessarily. Because I think that's a key thing that often happens then. If government clients then, sort of step in or feel that they need to step in and actually take on risk that shouldn't be coming to them, which was appropriately transferred at the start of the contract. I think as well, at the different spheres of government, there's also, different requirements. And I think in South Africa, in the municipal space, there's a massive requirement, to also learn, that flow down of the PPP and what it entails. I think there's a big requirement there.
Yes, I know at one stage it was envisaged, certainly in South Africa, that the Department of Public Works would be the centre of the PPP skill set. And that's certainly what the IPP officers tried to do with PPAs or IPP. Are you hearing any discussions around that sort of centralisation of skill set?
Look, I know that there's been a recent review of the PPP standards in South Africa. There's been that assessment, and I know that there's been talk about, how to look at the PPP unit and the role that they play. So as it stands at the moment, of course, they do play an advisory role. And I think it's about re-looking at about how that's structured, to really actually maybe, have that almost service excellence, that skills sitting there, and actually those people then become part of the team, the the implementing team in the institution to actually be there, not day to day, day to day, not only for once a week in a meeting, it's actually joining that team for a year, etc. I think could definitely make a difference in terms of, the comfort of those institutions.
Joshua, do you have in Uganda, a centralized department within government that would procure PPPs, IPPs, concessions, whatever they're called in Uganda?
Thanks, Bridget. Fortunately, we do. But I think the unit is in place. It has not benefited from previous deals that were done by the government in the infrastructure space. For some reason, what the government chose to do is it chose to disband the original unit, which we call the privatization unit, that was in place at the time. It was privatizing entities. Now, in addition to the privatization, that unit also would work on concessions. So you can imagine there was a lot of skill built while it was in operation. Obviously, skills from the success, but also from the failures, but skills nonetheless. So the disbandment of that unit, I think, has affected the government's ability to take in the learnings, but the policy is in place and there is indeed a PPP. Where there is a bit of a challenge is in proper streamlining the approach for procuring some of these projects. It has actually put in place a pipeline. So if you went onto our Ministry of Finance or got access to either our privatization website or our PPP website, you will find a pipeline of projects that the government is inviting investors to invest in. The issue is on how the investor is able to put in unsolicited bids and the rights that they are able to still retain in some of those bids, particularly if those bids add a real sense of value to government, because many times they actually do. Those are just a few things that need to be streamlined: procurement, project identification, and procurement. Thank you.
Yes, maybe just a short add on, Bridget, if you don't mind. For me, I think PPP pipeline is one of the things that actually will, not only for government but also for the private sector. People will keep a team, sort of occupied if there's a pipeline of projects. If you don't see the pipeline flowing, and that's for government and for private sector, then there won't be the skills actually and the capacity to deliver on those projects. So that is a key element.
I agree with you 100%. And I think in South Africa, sadly, we've seen the PPP pipeline dry up. And we've seen the companies that used to play in the space disband those PPP teams or those concession teams, depending on whether you were doing toll roads or in the built environment. And I think that is one of the very big issues that the current government is working on. And I do think that Africa doesn't have enough certain PPP pipeline. I'm not sure what the situation is like in Uganda or Nigeria. Adiola, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, sure. In 2008, I believe, the federal government set up an agency called the Infrastructure Concession Regulatory Commission. And this is the institution that has, more or less, taken custody of concession agreements and related agreements under the law that was set up for that purpose. One of the objectives of this agency is to monitor the development of, projects either on a PPP basis or on a concession basis, especially projects that have an element of government involvement. And this commission has been doing significant amount of work from that time to now. In terms of capacity, I think that the issue is one of interest, I would say. I think that government does provide a reasonable amount of resources for, personnel at institutions of this nature to develop skill sets that are required to support this project. And whether the relevant personnel do take these seriously enough is another issue. But I do find in my interaction certainly with some of these people that they have a significant amount of interest in this project, and some of them are quite knowledgeable. But it will be good to see more of them being involved, I would say.
I think a pipeline is a key issue for all of us on this call, from the advisory space to the lending space. It also helps people plan their resources and make sure they've got enough financial resources to get things done. We are getting to the end of our session, and you have all been absolutely fantastic, and I've really enjoyed this panel. It's been one of my favorites so far. I'm going to ask each of you for a few closing remarks as to what you think the future is for PPP's infrastructure in Africa, and what's your key wishes for an improvement. And you're not allowed to mention pipeline. I'm going to start with Anna Marie.
Bridget, I think, if you just look at the population growth in Africa, if you've looked at the forecasts, so I've recently done some studies on that, and, looking at cities, and they're looking that cities will be exploding for those cities without the required infrastructure and the planning. So I think in terms of PPP,
Anna Marie,
what we've been looking at is for governments to actually put that certainty. Oh, sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. We lost quite a bit of what you were saying.
I think it's load shedding that's playing a role here. But in essence, what I want to say is that I think my close to my heart is for governments to really make a serious point of putting PPP frameworks in place, and that capacity that we were talking about, actually making a serious attempt to capacitate their staff and their officials.
Great. Adeola, what is your chief desire apart from pipeline?
There are a couple. I think that African governments have to prioritize the ease of doing business. Right? I think that, they all need to adopt and they need to be aligned in relation to having consistent policies that promote the ease of doing business. Naturally, this is what will attract both local and foreign investors to participate more in infrastructure projects. I think the second point I'd like to talk about is, political will. And I did mention this at the start of this session. Governments need to continue to introduce clear policies and frameworks that seek to, mitigate the level of risks that investors undertake. There will always be risks in developing and deploying infrastructure projects, but the most important thing is to ensure that those risks can be mitigated in a manner that's satisfactory to both sides. And also, these mitigants should be such that parties are relatively comfortable. Parties are relatively comfortable in terms of how they are addressed, whether they need to look to support from international institutions that, for example, provide political risk guarantees, an instrument of that nature. is really important. I think the third thing I would like to talk about is that, African governments need to adopt sustainable project models. We find that increasingly the investors and indeed lenders are looking at sustainability indicators in investment opportunities, and therefore we need to, more and more or increasingly design projects in a way that it highlights long-term resilience or life cycle efficiency that embeds environmental, social, and governance best practices. This is an area of significance for development finance institutions, and I don't know whether Zodwa would have something to say about these, but I do find that this is an area of significance for DFIs in relation to their continuing interest in investing in Africa. And therefore, it would be good if project sponsors and government, find ways to ensure that this issue is adequately addressed.
On that note, I'm going to ask Zodwa, and I'm sorry, Zodwa, we are running out of time, for her top wish for Africa infrastructure.
Thank you, Bridget, once again. For me, it's just two things. Without having infrastructure development, there will be no recovery post this pandemic, so we need that recovery that is underpinned by the infrastructure development. And then two, I'm still hopeful as opposed to the being pessimistic about PPP, because we are seeing countries are heavily indebted at sovereign level. So what the countries are doing, they need to go back to the drawing board, have these PPP concessions so that they don't borrow as government. They are highly, if not careful, we'll go back to the days of their highly indebted, poor countries, the HIPC. So, and also the IMF is aware of that. And also they are also encouraging some of the countries like Angola, that they must, if they were to borrow, they must borrow on concessional funding, which is very difficult. So we are seeing there's some shift in how the countries are looking into going back to PPP projects once again, because they have no absorption capacity to borrow anymore. Thank you.
Okay, Zodwa, if you need a praise singer to do your praises when you have those discussions with governments before you have them, I'm happy to come along, because that's music to my ears. Joshua, I'm giving you the last word.
Thank you very much for that, Bridget. If you ask me what I think is the key thing from my perspective, local investment, local investment, local investment. What it does is it brings local knowledge into the project, which helps you first and foremost identify the right projects. I know governments, you told us not to talk about pipeline, but governments build these pipelines. But many times it is the local entrepreneur who will be able to strike it right from the get-go. Having local capital in these projects also helps to bring down, first of all, it cushions capital that comes in from other investors, and also helps to bring down the cost of financing. So I think local investment is key. And to spur it on, I think that the kind of product that Zodwa has talked about with project preparation facilities, those are the kinds of things that help local investors in various areas begin to look at how to structure these projects appropriately. I think it's one of the things that is easily overlooked, but I think it's absolutely critical to having sustained investment in infrastructure. And I think, Anna Maria, the load shedding there is in itself a very good investment opportunity for a local investor in SA. Thank you.
On that note, I'm going to say thank you very, very much to my panel. You have been one of the most interesting and thoughtful panels I have had the pleasure of moderating for a long time, and you've made my job very, very easy. Thank you, everybody, and hopefully we'll have the same panel again this time next year with more to talk about.
Thank you, Bridget. Thank you so much.
Thank you.